Hi, and welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be covering an experimental elicitation technique called prototyping. What exactly is prototyping to begin with? Prototyping is a user-based experimental process where design teams implement ideas into tangible forms of varying degrees of fidelity called prototypes. Now, what's that beast? Let's go through the different parts of this definition. The first characteristic that we encounter is user-based. Prototyping is an elicitation technique where the user is central. Prototypes are updated, adapted, transformed based on what users experience and say when using the prototype. The next characteristic that we encounter is experimental process. This points towards the fact that prototyping is not a one-shot exercise. You do prototyping on an incremental and iterative basis until you have a prototype that perfectly matches what your customers or users want. Prototyping is inherently a process of trial and error. The very course that you are following now has been following an experimental process. It is being updated constantly based on the feedback that I receive from you, the users. So please don't forget to leave a review. Furthermore, I would like to highlight the design team's characteristic. This can be a little misleading, as you might think that only user experience designers are doing prototyping. That is of course not true. Everybody who is creating a new product or service can be considered to be a designer. This can be an architect, a product manager, a data analyst, an operational engineer, a business analyst, etc., etc. Then we have implement ideas into tangible forms. This now is the essence of prototyping. You want to create a proxy of the product or service so that you can test it with users. Many great products have been created that way. Dropbox is a good example. In the beginning, they were testing the concept of Dropbox through a janitor type of prototype. This means that the users were testing out the functionalities of the product, but it was actually a human behind the scenes that executed the tasks. So users were giving feedback on Dropbox functionalities and not a single line of code was written yet. That way Dropbox was able to capture customer feedback very early in the development process. Lastly, we have degrees of varying fidelity. You need to know that there are multiple types of prototypes that you have to consider. These types distinguish themselves based on how closely they mimic the final product. This is called prototypes level of fidelity. Let's look closer at the two extremes, low fidelity prototypes and high fidelity prototypes. Low fidelity prototypes are a very simple and limited version of the solution. Think of prototypes made on a piece of paper, like a comic for instance. We will often find these prototypes in the early stages of software development lifecycle, where the concept is tested as a whole. On the other hand, you have high fidelity prototypes. These type of prototypes are already closer to what the actual solution should look like. Think of software-generated wireframes, which are actual screens of the solution's interface, with the right colors, labeling, information architecture, and so on. The only thing that's different from the real solution is that there is no code behind the screens. You will often find these type of prototypes towards the later stages of the development lifecycle. When should you use prototyping? Quite frankly, in a world that revolves around customer centricity, I would always use prototyping whenever building or updating a product or a service. It's a cheap and quick way to see if what you're building is the right thing for your users. So the question is really, why wouldn't you use it? Moving on with the questions on how to execute prototyping. Creating the prototyping itself falls outside the scope of this course, as we are only interested in the elicitation technique linked to prototyping, which is user testing. You might be happy to learn that you already know this technique, as it is very similar to the user review workshop, which you can find in the interface analysis part. So I invite you to rewatch that lecture if you are unsure about the execution steps. Moving on now to our trusty pros and cons. I will especially zoom on the pros and cons of low fidelity versus high fidelity prototypes. Starting with the pros of low fidelity. It can be done at almost no cost. There is no need for any skills in prototyping software. You can get feedback from users very quickly. It's best fitted to test concepts and ideas. It allows for very rapid trial and error, and it helps to structure discussions with users and stakeholders. Now, moving on to the low fidelity disadvantages. The lack of realism linked could tamper with the elicitation results, as you might not get relevant users' feedback. They could start filling in the gaps with their own imagination, so to say. There is the issue of oversimplification, so some aspects of the prototype might actually not be possible to develop. And there is also the lack of actual interactions with the limits of the elicitation results. Next up, we have the high-fidelity prototypes that very closely resemble the final solution. What are its pros? It's a very rich source of requirements. You can use high-fidelity prototypes to list all the requirements that you see and enrich it if you find gaps. It provides a very good picture of the solution, which makes it easy to use in discussions with all kinds of stakeholders, such as your business stakeholders, legal and compliance, developers, user designers, etc. It allows for rapid trial and error at a low cost. And it can be used in user tests, where you can already collect feedback early on the solution. This will also highlight less obvious areas of improvements, such as unforeseen user behavior, usability issues, etc. And to conclude, what are some of the cons linked to high-fidelity prototypes? The first one is that it's often costlier and it takes more time to make than low-fidelity prototypes. You might receive feedback during user tests on superficial details rather than on the inherent aspects of the solution. You need to have some skills with the prototyping software to create a prototype, and stakeholders and also developers might confuse the prototype with the final solution and actually go ahead and start to form their assumptions based on that and even develop it. And the last con I can think of is that there is sometimes a misplaced attachment to the prototype, which could interfere with making changes. Remember, you need to fail fast, it's trial and error, don't attach yourself to the prototype. Regarding best practices, I again advise you to have a look at the user review workshop in the lecture on interface analysis. Voila! This concludes the lecture on prototyping, and it also concludes this section on requirement elicitation techniques. If you want me to cover other elicitation techniques, don't hesitate to let me know. I will gladly cover them as well. In the next section, we will cover the next step in our elicitation journey, which is confirming your understanding. So confirming the information that you just conducted through all these nice techniques. I hope to see you there. Bye.